iGlobe News brings global views.
I would like to welcome our listeners to a new podcast series, iGlobe Views, where we will be discussing current events and world politics. My name is Diana Mautner-Markov, your host, and together with Professor Suzanne Weigel-Schwiertzig, a world-renowned expert on China, its history, politics, and security, we will today be discussing the topic, the China and Russia factor in the U.S.-Israeli strategy for Iran. For the record, this episode is being recorded on March 15th, 2026. The U.S. and Israeli attack took place in the middle of negotiations to reach a deal with Iran. In fact, both the Omani foreign minister and the Iranian foreign minister both said that they were making good progress and that the next talks were supposed to take place in Vienna. And 2 days later, on February 28th, the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran. For 3 decades, the Israelis have been trying to get the U.S. to attack Iran. So far, no U.S. president has agreed to this. President Trump has agreed to this and is now in the middle of a full-blown war with Iran. So my question is, was this a real miscalculation on the part of President Trump? Because decapitating the supreme leader has not worked. The regime change has not taken place. Did he think he could make a quick strike like he did in Venezuela?
Thank you for inviting me to start our conversation that way. And then thank you for this very interesting question. I'm pretty sure that someone like Donald Trump and someone like Bibi Netanyahu, they only go to war if they think they will win the war. Usually people who start a war always think that they will win the war. This is, by the way, also true for President Putin. He thought that if he went to war against Ukraine, he would be the winner, and not within years or months, but within days. No. So Hitler wanted a blitzkrieg. The Japanese want a blitzkrieg. Everybody wants a blitzkrieg because, that's such a wonderful situation. You attack someone, and after a few days, you reached your aim, and the war is over, right? Nobody will be really too aggravated and nervous about the situation. So I totally agree. I think that both Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu thought that they could end this war within a comparatively short period of time. But maybe for Donald Trump, this is a bigger question than for Netanyahu. Why? Because Donald Trump has two very important things to consider with regard to the length of the war. On the one hand side, he wants to visit China at the beginning of April. And I think he must know that it will be very, very difficult for China to invite him to come to China if the war in Iran is still going on. Secondly, of course, he has the midterm elections. And the end of the war has to be victorious and has to be far enough away from the midterm elections so that people will not consider this war too much in their decision whether or not to cast a vote for the Republicans or for the Democrats. And for that reason, he is under time pressure. And I think we can very well observe that every day he sort of tries to give us a message about the length of the war, whereas the Israeli side has already told us that they think that the war should go on as long as it takes. And this shows that there is already a problem between the Israeli side and the U.S.-American side because they don't have a strategy that is easy for them to sort of coordinate between the two of them. But now things are getting apart. And this is always the case when an original plan cannot come true.
Yes, I have to agree with you with that. If we compare this scenario to the June 2025 attack, the first attack of the U.S. on Iran, which was a one and done bombing, more or less. They came in, they targeted 3 nuclear reactors. President Trump declared victory, and it was over for him. Now, as you very astutely have remarked, President Trump is in a real dilemma because now he realizes his aims are not the same as those of the Israelis, which he probably should have realized before entering the war. The Israelis are in it for the long haul. That's been their goal all along, especially President Netanyahu. He really wants to see a destroyed Iran on the other side. And as you mentioned, that's not what President Trump wants. He would like to have an exit strategy here, which
He
is not
doesn't have.
really apparent.
Mm.
He doesn't have an
Unfortunately, he
exit
doesn't have
strategy.
an exit strategy because very often
Yeah.
you see that political actors can come to a consensus. And for example, in this case, I think the consensus was that they wanted to sort of induce regime change by decapitation, right? This was their idea about what was going to happen in Iran. And the problem is that this did not become true. And that is exactly the moment when two or three or more political actors suddenly realize that they have different ideas about what should be the next step. And I think this is very, very clear now. And because the original plan that was a consensus for both sides has not become true, that is why they now suddenly have different considerations. And I think that the different considerations also show that maybe their original aims were also more than just what they had defined at their consensus. So I think that, for example, the US side had to take a Chinese reaction into consideration before they took the decision to start the war. Whereas Israel does not feel obliged to take the Chinese reaction into consideration. And I think that this is already a very important difference between the two actors. And we see that it's not only because President Trump wants to visit President Xi Jinping at the beginning of April, but it is also because, quite clearly, the US had to withdraw certain forces from the East Asian theater to the Arabic Sea, like, for example, their flight carrier Lincoln. They had to bring this to the Arabian Sea, and this means that they are not as present in East Asia as they think they should be, and therefore they had to come to an arrangement with China before they could agree to going to war to Iran. And this is something that very often is overlooked and hardly ever discussed, but it's very, very important with regard to what is going to happen next and how can this war end and when will it end?
Yes, I mean, we can't, when we talk about China and we want to bring in China and Russia into the discussion
Mhm.
now, we can't forget that we have this whole issue with Taiwan, which always is part of the equation when we talk about U.S.-China relations. And as you mentioned, the U.S. has brought all its military assets now into the Middle East. And so China, more or less, has what it maybe always wanted, namely great dominance in its own backyard, so to speak. Also, President Trump has now, as far as I know, called President Putin and has also approached the Chinese and asked them if they could help come to a diplomatic solution here. And we know that the Chinese have been working the phones, and Foreign Minister Yi has been talking to all the Gulf states. And how do you see maybe China and or Russia helping this war come to an end? And is it in their interests, and maybe the interests of China and Russia are different here, for this war to end quickly?
Hmm. Well, I think that Foreign Minister Wang Yi said from the very beginning of the war that this war should be ended as soon as possible. He said recently in a very interesting press conference in Beijing, as you might know, there was the National People's Congress recently in Beijing, and Foreign Minister Wang Yi gave a press conference, and the room was overfilled with journalists from all over the world, and it was a very long press conference of nearly 2 hours. And in this context, he said, this war should never have started and it has to come to an end as soon as possible. And I think that this is actually the idea that the Chinese have, although we might think that you just mentioned this, that the fact that the US had to withdraw forces from the East Asian theater actually is good for the Chinese, right? But for the Chinese, the fact that the US is not there anymore is not really a solution to their problem. What they want is a step-by-step solution for the Taiwan problem. And I think they realize very well that now President Trump and the US is in a very precarious situation. They have to withdraw forces, not only their flight carriers, but now they're discussing the possibility of actually getting Patriots and THAAD, thought defensive weapons from South Korea to the Gulf states. So this shows that they're in a very precarious situation. China, of course, is also not in a very good situation because of the problem with, ships not getting through the Hormuz Strait. That means that China really had to make a lot of preparations in order not to be short of oil, because China doesn't know how long this war will last. So China is in a situation where it has to bargain with the US, and at the same time, they are very skillful in using a very bad constellation to their own benefit. And in this case, they combine the bad constellation for themselves and potentially also for Mr. Trump with the constellation that Mr. Trump definitely wants to come and visit China at the beginning of April. And so I think very typically for the Chinese, they defined a condition, we will not interfere directly into the Iran theater if you do us a favor. This is the so-called win-win situation, right? And what kind of favor do they want? They know that the Taiwanese side actually wants to have a new load of weapons coming in from the US. And as part of these new weapons, they also want to have offensive weapons such as the Tomahawk, about which we discussed so much in the context of the Ukraine war, right? So the Tomahawk is very, very bad for China. Why? Because the Tomahawk can hit areas of China which are very, very dense, very, very densely populated. So the problem is that if they want to hit maybe one military object, there will always be so many people in the surroundings of this object that China has to calculate that they have civilian casualties at a comparatively high number as soon as these offensive weapons will be employed by the Taiwanese side. And that is why China now thinks the next step to take in solving the Taiwan question is to talk the US out of giving any offensive weapons to Taiwan. And this is something that the US has always rejected to discuss with the PRC side in the past, because there is a promise from the US side towards the Taiwan government to say, we never talk and discuss any issues related to weapons with the PRC side, because it's quite clear that they don't want the PRC to have any leverage in the sort of conversations between Taiwan and the US on what kind of weapons to sell to Taiwan. So this time is really a very, very new constellation because, and I must say that President Trump actually discussed this question on February 16th while being on Air Force One. And I think in Europe, nobody has taken notice of this, but this is actually a very, very new development. And he said, yes, I'm going to visit President Xi Jinping at the beginning of April in order to discuss weapons for Taiwan. Okay. And this is what the Chinese side sort of defines as its benefit from not interfering directly into the war theater in Iran. And this situation, as you see, was already sort of nailed down 2 weeks before the war began. Yeah. And if you, for example, listen to Chinese TV at the time, they would always tell you that they think that this war is going to begin within the next days to come. So that they were always of this opinion, and we know that they made lots and lots of preparations, including buying more oil and gas from Russia than before, and things like this. So they made all kinds of preparations for this war to start. And if everybody had actually done the same thing I did, which is watching Chinese TV on a daily basis, you would never have come to the opinion that there is a chance for this war not to begin.
That's really interesting, because if you look at the European reaction, they were also surprised that the US and Israel attacked. It was as if they had no clue that this was coming their way. And it could be they didn't have a clue, that it was just Trump maybe discussing this with China ahead of time, China being another great power, Europe not being considered a great power. So that's a really interesting difference. Maybe bringing in the European perspective at the moment, we see that Europe has condemned the Iranian attacks on the Gulf states. I note that I didn't find a statement where it has attacked the US and Israeli strikes on Iran. Within Europe, the leaders have differentiated opinions. We have Friedrich Merz, who has put his weight on the side of the US and Israel, and you have Pedro Sanchez, who has condemned them. So once again, Europe is divided and does not have a singular reaction. Europe is, of course, when we talk about energy supply, where you mentioned the Chinese have been stocking ahead of time. They do have great oil reserves, which, of course, is not the case with Europe, which has been struggling ever since the Ukraine war. To make up this difference. Of course, the Gulf states have been there making up this difference. And once again, now Europe is in the situation that it doesn't know where it's going to get its energy from. Energy prices are going through the roof. Are we on the precipice of an economic disaster? And will once again Europe be the group that's going to pay for the brunt of this?
First of all, let me answer the question, why can Europe at this moment, although we are under a terrible threat, especially with regard to our economies, why can we not speak with one voice? I think it is very clear that we have to understand that the situation of Europe has changed enormously since President Trump took over last year. Why? Because he obviously wants to regroup military forces of the US, and he also wants to redefine his spheres of interest. So the US spheres of interest. And if you read the National Security Strategy from November of last year, word by word, you will find out that everything is in there. And many people say you don't need to read this, and they never work up to what they write in their security strategies. I don't agree to this at all. I think we should finally learn to read the strategies of our foes and friends very clearly and very closely, because otherwise we don't understand the world. So what does President Trump do? He actually wants to retreat forces from Europe in order to be able to be active in his immediate vicinity, which is Latin America and Canada. And he also wants to focus on East Asia, because he still thinks that China is a competitor, as they say, a near peer. And he has to make sure that China will not be able to overtake the US. So in which situation is Europe now? The US is no longer as interested in having the EU as a representative of Europe as their closest friend, especially as they're trying to normalize relations with Russia. They would have another way of relating to Europe if they related more strongly to Russia. So in this situation, the overlord that had always been a hidden actor in the EU constellation is becoming weaker and weaker and is retreating more and more from the scene. And this implies that the idea of the EU, that all nations who are member states of the EU are equal, now is really threatened and maybe we should say challenged. Why? Because so far we had a hidden actor that was more powerful than all other actors inside the EU individually, right? So the fact that we had a hidden actor that is called US at the back of our whole constellation in Europe made it possible for the EU to eventually speak with one voice. And you see very clearly that in the context of the war in Ukraine, the EU Commission actually sort of acted on behalf of the US during the Biden administration to make the EU speak with one voice. And the moment some countries realized that the EU cannot act in this function anymore because we had a change of president from Joe Biden to Donald Trump, then you see that suddenly all these different voices come up again. And now we have a constellation where Germany and France inside the EU and Great Britain from outside the EU actually compete to take over a leading position. And Mr. Merz says this very openly, a leading position inside the EU. And Mr. Trump and Mr. Stammer come to the opinion that they cannot take over this leading role without being aligned with the US to the point that they act as a proxy of the US inside the EU. Whereas France actually tries to define a position for itself where it says, we can actually have more autonomy if we distance ourselves from the US and define sort of a leading nation inside the EU that takes over this overlord position that so far the US had taken over. And this is the reason why we cannot come to one opinion, because obviously Mr. Stammer and Mr. Merz and Mr. Macron, they compete with each other. And Mr. Merz has taken the decision that he has to show Trump that he is his most loyal proxy in Europe. And by this, he wants to have Trump's support to taking over leadership in the EU. And at the same time, he wants to make sure that Trump and his entourage do not support the AfD in Germany. This is Merz's idea about the situation. And that's why, there is no criticism at all, of course, from the German side, concerning the attack on Iran. And other countries say, okay, we can understand that Israel is in a very precarious situation and that the US has to come to support of Israel. But we must also mention that this is against international law. They don't have the support of the UN. They don't have any mandate from the US American institutions. And that's why they think that this war has a problem, right? And this is as far as they go in criticizing.
So could we already say that Trump has won here, because divide and conquer is always a good strategy to have? And why interfere when your enemy is destroying itself? I'm not saying that Europe is now the enemy of the United States, but if Europe is so divided that it can't even speak with one voice, then already you can see that this is not going to work out well for the Europeans as a group.
Yeah.
Meloni, I would like to mention, in this case, has come out against the Israeli
Mhm.
and the Iranian attack on Iran. So she, once again, has shown leadership by going against her close ally, President Trump. And we know that President Meloni and President Trump do get along very well and agree on many points. But she is not afraid to come out and call a spade. And as you said, the whole issue of international law is really a grave issue in this case, because this was an unprovoked attack. They were in the middle of international negotiations to come to an agreement on Iran's nuclear program and on the US sanctions. And then this attack came, and there is no way one could say that this is in accordance with international law and with the UN Charter. One can't just go and attack other sovereign nation. When this happened with Ukraine and Russia, the world was very quick to respond. In this case, it's not so quick to respond, especially the European Union has not come out with an official statement condemning it and calling a spade a spade. So Trump has, in this sense, already won. And of course, the Chinese are also just lying back, and the Russians are, I would say, the great benefactors in this case, because they're gaining from the oil and gas prices, which are going through the roof. The Europeans have bought, now in February, all the Arctic gas they could from Russia. Trump has taken away the sanctions now for 30 days to be continued. Who knows? So now all the oil that's been loaded on ships worldwide can be bought without any U.S. sanctions. The Europeans have once again affirmed their sanctions on Russia. No one's really interested in their sanctions. They're afraid of U.S. sanctions. So once again, the Europeans have come out looking really weak, really divided. I don't think Merz is going to be very successful. As you mentioned, he wants to be maybe the new leader of Europe and bring President Trump on his side. But we all know that President Trump already has come out saying that he wants a so-called free election in Germany, which means anyone who wins, and that would include the AfD party, should be able to form a coalition, namely also a coalition with the CDU-CSU, which is Friedrich Merz's party. So I'm not quite sure how this is going to work for Friedrich Merz in this case. So we have a very interesting movement of actors going on here, and I don't see the European actors coming out ahead. And of course, if we want to bring Russia and Ukraine into this discussion, Ukraine is definitely on the losing side here, and I would put Russia on the winning side. How would you see that?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's not a question of Europe being weak and not speaking with one voice. I think that Europe has a totally a wrong strategy in this very difficult and complex situation. So why do I think that they have a wrong strategy? Because it is quite clear that all the European leading nations actually want to define Europe as a world power. However, neither the Russians nor the US, and to a certain degree up until recently also the Chinese, never said that Europe could be a world power. They actually look upon Europe as a middle power, not as a world power. And only recently, and this is also something that we can't read in the newspapers because we don't listen to Mr. Wang Yi's press conferences. Well, on this press conference last Sunday, actually, it was a week ago, he said that he thinks that Europe should definitely have a role to play in a future multipolar world, which is a way of saying, I think that Europe should be among the leading nations of the world, which is, I think, something that neither the US nor Russia has voiced during the last months and years even. But Europe insists they want to be regarded as a world power. At the same time, they're declining economically. They have a really big problem in defining their foreign policy, and they are also not very strong militarily. So if nobody acknowledges you as a world power and you don't fulfill any of the core criteria that you might want to bring in order to convince people that you are a world power, then maybe you should think about your definition of yourself. And I think that if the EU realized that it is not a world power, but a middle power, it would immediately come to a totally different foreign policy. And this foreign policy would be a foreign policy of multi-alignment, which, for example, many nations in Southeast Asia and South Asia are actually pursuing. India, of course, is not a small country, but it's also not acknowledged world power. So what does India do in order to make sure that it plays a major role in the future world order of multipolarity? It has a foreign policy of multi-alignment. And multi-alignment implies that you have good relations with all of the three big nuclear powers, the US, Russia, and China. You cannot exclude any of them. So excluding Russia is already a very big mistake. So for a certain period of time, the EU Commission was taking into consideration to also exclude China. They called it decoupling, then they call it de-risking, right? So they thought they could actually sort of exist in this world, having two of the three major nuclear powers against them and being totally dependent on this one nuclear power that is very, very important for the security of Europe, and therefore can actually sort of demand everything from us. So this is, I think, a totally wrong sort of definition of the European Union as a world power, which then actually is the reason for all these other weaknesses, the incapacity to speak in one voice, and all these things. From my point of view, you can derive them, you can understand them if you understand that the EU has a wrong self-image. And I think this is something that now maybe some people are already starting to consider, especially after the Prime Minister of Canada said in Davos that the middle powers have to find a strategy to actually combine their strengths in order to be able to sort of avoid sort of coercive means by the big nuclear powers against them. And I think he used this word middle power several times in his speech. And now suddenly this wording is sort of becoming acceptable. But I remember clearly that when I voiced this idea about like 1 or 2 years ago, people would just look at me and say, what the hell is she saying? But I think now they suddenly realize that maybe they should sort of redirect their way of looking at the world a little bit. So I think this would actually make the situation for Europe much better if we had come to this sort of analysis, if we would have understood that we are a middle power, then redefine our foreign policy. And to a certain degree, very interestingly, Ursula von der Leyen just recently said, somehow Europe cannot be the only continent to defend the traditional sort of world order. We have to be part of a new world order. Okay, this is maybe already one step in the right direction.
But the big elephant in the room, which is missing in the European equation, is, of course, its non-existent relationship with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And if we want to bring Iran back into the discussion now, Russia, of course, I think it is now widely accepted, is going to be a winner in this conflict and this war between Israel and US on one side and Iran on the other side. Russia is going to profit not only from the incredibly rising prices of oil and gas, but also because of the sanctions, which have now been taken away from the US side, and because also the US is actively seeking Russian support to end the war and looking for an exit strategy, which so far maybe is not really apparent and doesn't exist for the US. And as we already mentioned, Israel doesn't want an exit strategy in the first place. So if we want to look at now the new world order, this is what's really missing for Europe, because Europe has put all its eggs in the Ukrainian basket and has decided it wants absolutely nothing to do with Russia for now and forevermore. How can Europe accept its position as a middle power? How can Europe move forward and have anything to say if it's excluding Russia from the discussion? And as we see now, Russia is just now going to become more and more powerful and successful with this whole war in Iran. It's going to be a positive effect for the Russian economy, for the Russian war in Ukraine, for Russian relationship with many countries.
Mhm.
Also regarding China-Russia relations, Russia is going to become have more say in this. As of course the oil prices go up, it's going to make more money. It's going to be able to put it into its war chest. Ukraine is going to have less weapons as weapons get depleted, as they're being used in the Middle East by the United States itself. It all hangs together. And as you say, Europe has to find its place, but it also has to start talking to Russia again.
Yes, definitely. I think maybe we should understand that Mr. Trump actually sort of views the US as the most important actor among the three nuclear powers. So why does he undertake all these astonishing, if not say disruptive actions? You wake up in the morning and you say, oh my God, he did it again, right? And so why does he do this? Because by doing this, he shows the world that it is the US who day by day actually defines our agenda, right? And as the US has economic problems, it has an overstretched problem, 900 US military bases all over the world, and we now see in the Near East that to have a US base in your country is maybe not always such a very good idea because they are being attacked and they cannot easily defend themselves. And actually, we also see that not only these bases are being attacked, but also, civilian and other structures in the respective countries. So the US is actually not in a position where everybody would say, okay, we listen to the US and we know what to do. But Donald Trump is very skillful in having all these projects that impose on the world the US agenda. And this is what he does. This is what he does with Venezuela. This is what he does with Iran. This is what he's maybe going to do with Cuba and all his different projects, right? And if he says, I'm not interested in Ukraine anymore, he also imposes his agenda on us, right? So by doing this, he actually sort of creates an image of the US as if the US were still the one and only dominating power of the world. And most people don't know that he gives a call to Mr. Putin and he gives a call to Mr. Xi Jinping because Donald Trump knows that he cannot rule the world without China and Russia, right? At this particular moment, he is not in a situation where he can impose his agenda on China and Russia. But he is strong enough with all his different sort of projects and actions to sort of create a win-win situation between the US and Russia and between the US and China. So that, very interestingly, I will tell you, everybody, all of these three major countries will proclaim that they actually had a benefit from this constellation. Yeah. And so the benefit for the US will be that they can declare, we supported Israel with all our might. Our military is really, really strong. We destroyed so many of our enemies' ships and all these kind of things. Iran is in a terrible situation. And we destroyed their nuclear capacity. And this was what we wanted to do to begin with, right? Then China will say, you know what? We will, of course, and we have always supported Iran. We are very good friends of our global South countries. We do our best to support them. And we even had a say in bringing this war to an end, which is definitely good for Iran. So we also benefited from the situation. And then Russia will say, okay, we also benefited from the situation. They might not speak up so openly about this, but they will mention all these things that you just mentioned among themselves, So this war is not bad for us. This war is good for us. So very interestingly, the three major powers can actually agree on ending this war whenever Mr. Trump wants them to end the war. However, he does not understand that minor actors in this constellation have a very important role to play. as we see, Donald Trump cannot end the war in Ukraine because neither Ukraine nor Russia wants to end the war. So how will Mr. Trump end this war in Iran if neither Israel nor Iran wants to end the war? Because for Iran to say, okay, we want to end the war, that will be used by both Israel and the US as a form of capitulation. And Iran is definitely not telling its people that unfortunately they will have to capitulate. So for that reason, I think Iran is not going to say, okay, yes, we can end the war. No, they're not. And for them, the victory in the war is their survival. So as long as they can survive, they can tell their population every day, whenever the war ends, say, we won the war because they wanted our annihilation, and this didn't happen. We are still a country, a sovereign country that is totally in ruins, but nevertheless, we are still a sovereign country and our political system still works. So this is for them actually the victory. And that's why they can, whenever they come into a situation which does not look like capitulation, and the other side gives them comparatively good terms, like, for example, giving them money in form of reparations to rebuild a country, then they can say, okay, we can come to an end. But if the other side doesn't give them very good conditions, I think the point has not been reached yet where they can actually say, okay, we can end the war. So it's a very, very tricky situation. And of course, Donald Trump wants to show us again that the US is the most dominating power in the world by saying, like last year, after 12 days, he said, okay, now the war has reached its end. But I think it will be very difficult to do this again. And as we know, the longer a war goes on, the more difficult it is to end the war. And now the war has already gone on for more than 10 days. And every day that it will go on, it will be more difficult to end.
Do you think the longer the war goes on, the more Russia and China will gain compared to the United States in that so-called balance of power, if we take the three main powers? And also the fact that the Iranians have not immediately risen up as Donald Trump thought they would and overthrown their leader, because, of course, the hate for the outside actors, and in this case, mainly Israel, but probably also the United States, is a unifying factor, the rally round the flag factor.
Yeah.
So that will also help Iran, as you say, survive longer and longer, because this common bond, I mean, one saw that also in Iraq when the US invaded Iraq. I don't think there was a lot of love there for Saddam Hussein, but people rallied around the flag. And then it became this long, drawn-out war in Iraq with so many casualties, and it became this huge disaster for the United States, honestly. So is this what we're going to see repeat here? Is the U.S. actually going to send troops there? We saw that Donald Trump moved a bunch of Marines, so very
2,500,
elite troops. Yeah, elite troops into the area. How will this play out? Do you think Russia, China will gain in power compared to the others? Do you think the Iranians will be able to hold on here very long? Because of course they've been preparing for this for a very long time, and they probably have more offensive missiles. Where these drones, there are probably tons of those they could use, as opposed to the the technology needed to fight these is limited and cannot be produced without end, whereas the technology needed to produce these offensive weapons is, of course, much easier to reproduce. Another issue, which is a problem for Ukraine, by the way, on the back burner. So how do you see this? How do you see this constellation? Will they move closer to Iran? There's so many, and then of course we have to bring in the Gulf states, but we can do that in the next round. There's so many things moving here, but obviously things are not going the way the US wanted, and there's not this general revolution happening. So this doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. And as you said, Israel doesn't want to end it, and there are three parties in this war. So even if Donald Trump says, I want to end the war. How can Trump now convince Israel to say, look, this is over now. I've had enough. As you said, Trump has different fish to fry, so to speak. He wants to go to China. He wants to have a good relationship with Russia and China. He wants to win those midterm elections. Those are number one on his plate. I mean, he has a whole lot of different goals that are much more important than this war in Iran, where many people are wondering why he did this in the first place. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think there are still quite a lot of options for how this thing is going to evolve within the next weeks to come. First of all, Mr. Trump, as we already heard, has good reasons to end this war. But on the other hand, both Iran and Israel might have good reasons not to end the war. So what is his option here? His option is actually to pull out of the war, to walk away from the war and leave it to the regional actors. So this would be a comparatively logical decision to take, because in the national security strategy, the US actually formulated quite openly that they think that security issues in the region should be solved by the regional actors. And President Trump could easily argue that he needed to support Israel in order to strengthen Israel as his regional proxy to solve the regional problems by regional means, right? So that would imply that actually Israel would go on fighting against Iran, whereas the US could retreat so that Donald Trump could say, okay, we're not part of this war anymore. I can go to China and visit Mr. Xi Jinping. And I can also tell my voters that the US is not going for unending wars anymore. So I think this is maybe the solution that he will find. However, unfortunately, this would imply that the other countries in the region, in the Gulf region, will see themselves in a very, very difficult situation, because they already realize that having U.S. Military bases in their countries was not to their benefit, but more an additional danger to their country's security and stability. So if the U.S. retreats from the region, this will strengthen the idea among the Gulf countries that they should no longer align with the U.S. And this is, of course, something that Iran wants to achieve. That is, that these Gulf countries say, you know what, bye-bye to U.S. Military bases in our countries. Right. And in this situation, of course, then Israel would be very, very isolated. And this would, of course, also be very much to the detriment of Israel's aims for the region. And I think that Israel has the aim for the region to dominate the region to a point that no other country can be a threat to Israel any longer. But if the countries the Gulf countries do not align with the US anymore, but tend more towards China and indirectly are more on the Iran side than on the Israeli side, then this is, of course, a very, very big problem for Israel. And this is maybe one of the reasons why if Mr. Trump takes the best option for the US, which is walking away from the war, Mr. Netanyahu will immediately fly to Washington and try to explain to him that this is an existential threat for Israel. So this is a very complicated situation. So what will Russia and China do? According to my understanding of the situation, is that China actually does not want the situation to escalate, because Iran is such an important source for China's oil and gas. So if the war goes on, China might still get some oil and gas from Iran, but the more Israel can fulfill its plan of destroying those oil equipments and oil installations in Iran, the more difficult it will be for Iran to actually continue giving oil to China or selling oil to China. So from that point of view, China doesn't want Iran to be totally destroyed. It definitely doesn't want for its oil producing capacity to be destroyed and for its gas producing capacity. And for that reason, it wants the war to de-escalate and come to a halt. So as long as this works out, China can stay in this setting as a hidden actor. But what if the US decides before we actually walk away from this war, we have to go for yet another round of escalation? Well, then things will get really difficult for China. Also, because Russia actually wants China to get more involved, because it is quite obvious that one of the reasons why Mr. Trump actually considered that a war in Iran could be quite beneficial to the overall situation for the US was that he thought that Russia needed to come to support for Iran. So he could say, and support is not just sharing intelligence and maybe giving weapons and things to Iran. It would be militarily intervening into the situation the way Russia interfered into the situation in Syria. Because in this situation, then everything would turn out good for Ukraine, because obviously Russia would have to pull out some of its forces that it's now employing in Ukraine, or that it is now employing in order to safeguard the security of its own country and population, and give this support to Iran. So, of course, Moscow said, I'm very sorry, we are not jumping into the trap that Mr. Trump actually installed for us. We cannot interfere militarily into the situation in Iran. Consequently, they asked China, what can you do? Right? And China says it's against our principle to send our troops to any other country in this world. And if we do anything militarily, we will only do it in our immediate vicinity. And Iran is a very good friend of us, but it's not a country that we define as part of our sphere of influence. Right? So that's why we cannot interfere militarily. But what if the US decides before walking away from this war, we escalate? So in this situation, I think China can only do one thing, which is it can create a difficult situation for the US in its own sphere of influence, which is East Asia. And in East Asia, we have three places where China could do something. One is South China Sea, a sort of limited conflict between the Philippines and China. This is something we are already getting used to because it happens ever so often, but it could be a little bit more, right? Second, of course, Taiwan. I don't think that they would invade Taiwan because they know very well that this is militarily a very bad constellation, but they could go for yet another round of blockade. And this blockade could be longer than before because the US had to retreat from the region and cannot sort of deter China from blockading Taiwan for a longer period of time. And the third conflict zone, of course, is Korea. China wouldn't have to do anything if North Korea did something against South Korea. That would, of course, be very, very dangerous for the US, especially as they're now taking Patriots and thought defense systems from the region. So I think if there is this possibility of escalation, that the US actually goes for yet another round of escalation, then we could see China coming into a situation where the global South and also Russia is pushing China into doing something that makes the US look really bad. And so there are quite a number of options in front of us. And we don't know whether the most logical option, which would be for the US to walk away from the war as soon as possible, for Mr. Trump to travel to China, and for China getting a benefit from the situation by coming to an agreement that Taiwan would not be provided with any kind of offensive weapons, Well, this would be sort of the best solution for the world at large, not necessarily for Taiwan. But I'm afraid that it is not so easy for the US to walk away from the war without trying out whether it could yet reach a little bit more of what it had originally planned to reach by going through yet another round of escalation.
So this very, very interesting, your analysis. And it fits into what's been happening. So if we look at, for instance, the Kharg Islands, which the attack happened, I believe, on Friday. Donald Trump then declaring a total victory, which of course is a bit premature. But they only went after the military targets there.
Yeah.
So if we were to follow your line of thought, of course, Donald Trump said, if you don't open the Strait of Hormuz, we will go after your energy assets, Iran's energy assets on this island. We all know that 90% of Iran's crude oil goes through this island. So this would be a major blow to China as well. And this would absolutely be also in the interest of Israel. If the U.S. were to, so to speak, go up the escalation ladder itself before leaving and striking the energy assets on the island of Kharg before leaving, that would be an interesting thought experiment to think about, but does not seem unlikely at this present point, if that would happen. And also thinking about your suggestions about how China could maybe involve the U.S. Somewhere else to make it even more uncomfortable for the U.S. Let us not forget that the leader of North Korea came out in support of Iran and more or less joined the war, whatever that means, on the side of Iran. So I think that the South Koreans at this point should be a bit nervous, because we all know North Korea does have nuclear capability. Not that I think they're going to use it, but that, of course, is a great deterrent for them, because, you know, they have the deterrent already, which leads me to another issue that isn't this, if Iran did not want nuclear weapons, and of course DG Rafael Grossi has confirmed on many occasions that Iran was not developing nuclear weapons, is this war the guarantee that after this should end at some point, Iran will definitely leave the NPT and want to develop nuclear weapons?
I think from a rational point of view, let's put it like this, there's very good reason for Iran after such a terrible war to say, you know, if we had nuclear weapons already, then the US would never have, and Israel would never have dared to attack us. And I think one of the reasons why Israel and the US became comparatively nervous in this situation is because they understood very well that if they went on the way they did in the past, which is if they took many of the assets of Iran in the region away from Iran, eventually Iran would not be able to feel safe without having a nuclear weapon. And for that reason, I think that after a war like this, there's more reason to believe that Iran will have a nuclear weapon than before. So in this situation, the only thing you can do is actually start bargaining with Iran on the question of how this country can benefit from not using its nuclear capacity. Yeah, that's the only thing you can do. If you start a war against them and they come to the rational conclusion that there is no way out for them but to develop a nuclear weapon, then you will see that they will have a nuclear weapon within a comparatively short period of time, although you might have destroyed some of their facilities. And once they have the nuclear weapon, you will have to consider them whenever you distribute power within the region, and whenever you think about, you know, how powerful actually your main competitor is. And if you look at, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has Russia and China and Pakistan and India and maybe Iran as nuclear powers. And when you compare this with G7, you will see, oh, right, on the other side of the world, if you look among the G7 countries, there is, of course, the US, there is Great Britain, but Great Britain can only use its nuclear weapons if it has US consent. And then there is France, which is the only country that has nuclear weapons, although a very, very small number, but they don't need US consent for using them, right? So the situation is quite interesting. And you see how actually it is both in Russia's and in China's interest to have more nuclear powered countries in their organizations and then use these organizations to come to a solution as to how these nuclear weapons could be used under which conditions. So then they are suddenly terribly powerful, especially China and Russia, because they actually the overlords of a number of countries that have a limited number of nuclear powers, and they're using these nuclear powers mainly to deter other countries from going for regime change. But when it comes to war, then the other sides, the US and its allies, have to think deeply about how far they can walk up the escalation ladder without forcing the other side to come to a decision that they want to use nuclear weapons. And this is already a constellation that we had, during the year 2023 and 2024, when the US really had to calculate, can we go up the escalation ladder without Russia coming to the conclusion that this is an existential threat to their country. And as their nuclear strategy defines, if this is an existential threat to their country, then they can use nuclear weapons, right? And so I think this constellation actually is very dangerous and is more beneficial for the Russia-China side than for the US, Israel, and other allies on the Western side. And I think maybe that this is a calculation that they didn't make before they decided to go into this war.
Yeah, the whole nuclear factor, I think, is something that I have the question of the nuclear factor I wanted to discuss, and then the Gulf states as our final topic before leaving. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia already in September signed a strategic mutual defense agreement, so that Pakistan is, of course, not a member of the NPT, that Saudi Arabia would be underneath the nuclear umbrella of Pakistan. Now, recently in March, we have a defense cooperation agreement between Brazil and South Africa. So we have all these new arrangements coming about. This is also could be considered a total failure of the US's position in the Gulf, where now also the Gulf states and other states are seeing that having a base of the US, a huge US base on your soil, is not protecting you, because they're being bombed. The US is not coming to their defense, and now that there is an escalation ladder that might happen, question number one, will Israel maybe use a nuclear weapon? We all know Israel has at least 200 nuclear weapons against Iran. And when this should end, we see these new pacts forming. What does this mean for NATO? And will this be a weakening of the US side as this plays out at the end, where the Gulf states are going to maybe look for new alliances in China, in Russia, because they feel like they were not treated well during this conflict?
Yeah. I think that there is a situation in the making which has many, many loose ends, which I cannot put together at this moment in a very decisive way, because it is a situation in the making and it has only just started. First of all, if you speak about, these alliances like between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, it's quite interesting that both countries are members of Russia and China-led organizations such as BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And it is quite interesting that we do not see that they actually say, oh, why don't we use Shanghai Cooperation Organization as an organization that is quite strong? We have many nuclear powers in our organization, but we are strong also insofar as we are like an anti-NATO organization. Very interestingly, China says no. Russia has been pursuing this idea for a comparatively long period of time, but China says no. And when you see any kind of readouts from conversations between China and Russia, you will always see that China does not want an alliance with Russia, right? This is, I think, a very interesting constellation. And this implies that it also doesn't want a constellation where it is not the final decision maker on war and peace if China has to go to war against another country or if another country goes to war against China. So China is here a very decisive factor that actually forces other countries to go into bilateral situations, such as between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. So what do these sort of constellations actually sort of produce or generate as a power asset for these countries? I think that these countries are actually using these bilateral agreements in order to be able to deter other countries from hitting them. And I think there are many countries in the global south now that are very much afraid of Mr. Donald Trump getting for yet another round of decapitation, right? He already told us very openly, and you can read it in the national strategy of the US, that he thinks that China should not be in Latin America. And this also implies that he thinks that no country in Latin America should be good friends with China. So if you have a regime like Brazil that is good friends with China, then maybe Brazil has to be afraid of being sort of hit by the US because of one reason or the other. And suddenly, you lose your president and he's somewhere in a prison in the US. So in this situation, to have bilateral sort of security contracts with other countries shows the US that if the US does something against you, it will not only have a problem with one country, but with more than one country. And I think that it is this deterrent factor that makes these countries uh, come to these kind of contracts with other countries. And it's not so much that they're actually combining their military forces, because very often, as you see between Brazil and South America, it's very, very far away. So if anything happens, it's very difficult for South Africa to do anything that is of real value, right? But to show the world that your country is being supported by other countries in its security interest, I think is something that might deter bigger countries from imposing their idea on your country. And I think that this is the main reason why. And now we see that in a situation where Iran is attacked and both Russia and China are sort of closely allied with Iran, but they cannot interfere directly. I think that this is a really big problem, and for that reason, um, these contracts need to be sort of made and shown in public that you have these kind of contracts, also to assure your own population that you are not isolated in this world.
Very, very interesting insights here, Suzanne. Thank you so much. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've really covered so much more than just the China-Russia factor, but I think we've really delved deeply into how world shifting of power between the various big actors is going to play out, or might play out because of the U.S. and Israeli war or strategy on Iran, as we call it. We will see what the coming weeks will bring. And From my side, I think this was a wonderful discussion, and I hope to continue it very soon. And thank you so much for taking your time. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we end the podcast?
Just like to say thank you for this very interesting conversation. I think it is very important in this very complicated world that we learn to put ourselves into the shoes of different actors and their ideas and their interests and their visions of a future world order. And I think there are many things we can still talk about that we did not discuss today. So it's fine from my side to meet you again and to continue our conversation. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Absolutely. I look forward to a continuation very soon. And for our listeners, thank you for tuning in to iGlobe Views. And of course, you will find this on all our social media channels. And please also visit our website at www.iglobenews.org. Thank you very much. Thank you, Suzanne.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.